Hey guys, it's Father White. Before we share this week's homily, I first want to take this opportunity to thank you for tuning into our podcast. I hope that it provides encouragement and support in your relationship with Jesus. I'd also like to share with you something amazing that's happening at St. Leo. We recently received a $250,000 match opportunity from the Stellar Family Foundation to support our church renovation. Since then, we've received about 1/3 of that in cash and about another third of that in pledges. And our hope is to fundraise the last 1/3 before Christmas. I know that there are so many good causes out there to support because there's so many great things happening in our area through the work of nonprofits. But nonetheless, it would mean so much to me and to our people if you would consider making a pledge to help us meet the match. We are a small parish with a big mission to bridge heaven and earth. You can learn more about how we do that in the links provided in the description. Thank you again, and may God bless you. Growing up, my parents always told me that I could do anything that I put my mind to. Just to kind of encourage and explain how if we set our mind on something and work hard enough, we can achieve whatever it is we're trying to achieve. And I'd say that works with most things in life, except for golf. It doesn't work with golf. I'm terrible at golf. I didn't grow up playing golf, and so it was only, after I was ordained a priest that I touched the golf club for the first time. And I tried early in my priesthood to pick it up because I thought, this might be a way I can connect with people. And so tried a few times, watched the YouTube videos, heard the explanation, went to the range, driving range. And it was hard, y'all. And no matter how hard you try, it's like the harder I would try, the worse I would get. It's like, how is that possible? Well, and the reason is because I would get so tense and I'd be focusing so much and so tense and focused and I would try to swing so hard to go so far and I would just completely miss the ball and it would be so embarrassing and deflating. But then when I would relax and kind of just, be a little bit more intuitive about it, I was able to focus more on the technique and do at least a little bit better. Still not sufficient enough, and that's why I don't play golf anymore. But it's interesting how it's not always just about working harder. Working harder does not always translate into more success and achievement. Technique is really important, and a lot of times technique is sometimes more important than the effort itself. This is also true in swimming. Those that swim a little bit more seriously will be able to tell you that it's not so much about trying to move your arms faster and more frantically, but rather about achieving the perfect technique. Same thing with rowing. You think about in the Olympics, the rowing team. It's not about can they go faster, it's can they be in perfect unison and have that perfect technique, and then they glide along the water. Or you think about productivity at your job. Sometimes maybe you have an office job and you have to work with computers. You think about, back in the day, you'd have to type in each email address from this list that you have, and you're tediously trying to make sure all the emails are right. You put it all in, and you might spend 30 minutes, an hour on that. And then maybe you learn the trick of just importing from an Excel document into the email list, and boom, that took 2 seconds, and it was so much easier. You didn't have to go through all that tedious, extra hard work. You were working smarter, not harder. So I just point that out because there's all over the place. Technique is sometimes more important than effort. Not that we don't try, not that we don't do effort, but our technique is so important. And if we don't have the right technique, it could even be to our detriment, no matter how hard you try. And the reason I point that out is because this is especially true in the spiritual life. The technique is really crucial here. And a lot of times we can get it wrong. We might, first of all, we know that we're supposed to be a good person. We're not supposed to be selfish. We're supposed to be more patient, less greedy, less overindulgent. You're not supposed to lose your temper, not supposed to say your cuss words. We know all that stuff, and yet we still find ourselves doing it. and we don't know how to we don't know how to grow and how to get further into our faith. And sometimes, even though we try really, really, really hard to be better, we find ourselves sometimes even getting worse, further from the Lord, more discouraged and defeated and more sinful. And if that's the case, perhaps maybe it's the technique that we're messing up with. So I want to start with today's gospel here to give a little context. We're in Mark chapter 9. Last weekend, we had a reading that sounded very similar to this weekend's reading. Last weekend was from Mark chapter 8, and it was the first time in Mark's gospel that Jesus gives the prediction that he is going to suffer, die, and rise. He tells it to them in plain speech, just to give it to them clearly. Give it to me straight. He says, the Son of Man will suffer, die, and on the third day rise. He told it to them, and if you recall last week, they didn't get it. Peter, rebukes Jesus, like, hey, trying to encourage Jesus maybe. We're not sure why, but anyway, the point is, Jesus tells Peter, get behind me, Satan. That was all last week. That was Mark chapter 8. Then a couple of other things happen in the gospel, and we eventually get to Mark chapter 9, which is what we have today. And Jesus gives it to them again, plain speech, just exactly the same thing. The Son of Man must suffer, he must die, and 3 days later, he will rise. But they're still struggling to understand. They even say they're too afraid to ask questions. It's just not translating. And to help us understand why it's not translating, Jesus is using the term Son of Man, which is one of his favorite titles that he uses in the Gospels for himself. And this comes from the prophecy of Daniel in the Old Testament. I might have explained this before, but it'll be a little refresher. Daniel in the Old Testament has that vision of what he describes as something that looks like a son of man. In other words, the son of a human being. In other words, a human person. It looks like a human person, but it's coming from the clouds in the sky in all of the divine glory. And so the prophet Daniel is pointing to this mysterious union between divinity and humanity in what he describes as what looks like a son of man. So Jesus is the perfect unity of divinity and humanity, fully human, fully God, comes together in the incarnation, and Jesus describes himself as the fulfillment of that prophecy, the Son of Man. Well, remember that prophecy, it's about this character in all of his divine glory. Well, they're expecting the Son of Man to bring in all this glory, and yet Jesus is saying that he's going to suffer and die. That doesn't make sense, at least not in their brains. It seems paradoxical. It seems like an oxymoron. How can this match up? If you're supposed to be the Son of Man in all of his glory, why would you be talking about suffering and dying? That doesn't go. It just doesn't go. But you see, the way of Christ is different. The technique is different. The way of Christ, even though he's all-powerful, he's God, and God is almighty, even though he has all the power, the way that he reveals his power is through powerlessness. It's through laying down his life, suffering and dying. How does he conquer Satan and evil in the world? Through powerlessness. It's upside down. It's not what we would intuit. It's different. The technique is counterintuitive. But this is the way of Christ. And it's also, therefore, the way of the Christian. That we, too, reveal God's glory in our weakness. This is the great wisdom of all the saints, really, throughout the history. But in particular, in recent times, I believe this is one reason why St. Therese is so popular and relatable and talked about so much, because she talks about what we know as the little way of St. Therese. And this little way, maybe you've heard about the small acts, do small acts with great love. And that's part of it. In fact, Mother Teresa took that and kind of really beautifully expressed that through her charism with the Missionaries of Charity. But the little way is more about this little way of trust, this little way of letting go, this little way of revealing your powerlessness so that God can be powerful in your life. And I truly believe that the single most difficult thing that keeps us away from growing in our spiritual life is control. We all cling to it. We cling to control. And this is me opining here, but I believe the reason is because when we cling to control, we're trying to avoid suffering. And whenever we let go of control, if anyone's ever tried to do that before, chances are you probably eventually started to suffer. And once you started to suffer, you started to probably rein back in the control because that didn't feel good. So I'd rather just have control so I don't have to suffer anymore. And it is kind of how it goes. When we let go, yes, we can trust in God. He is our Father and He's provident and He provides for us. But in the meantime and throughout the process, there will be some suffering. And many of us just can't handle that. And we'd rather just take back control. And that becomes a barrier in our relationship with God. The little way is about letting go and trusting, even through the suffering, even through the discomfort, even through the challenges. Why? Why is that part of it? Some of it's a mystery, but part of the mystery is because as we suffer in trust, we learn the art of dying to self for the sake of love. And that's the point of living, to be like God. God is love, and God gives Himself totally, and we can't do that when we cling to our control. It's scary, it's hard, but nonetheless, it's so possible in even just the most ordinary moments of our life, this little way of trust, mercy, and love. It's different. It's powerless. It's becoming like a child who can't make all the decisions for himself, but instead has to obey and follow his parents and their will for the child's life. This is hard. The good news is that each of you, if you've been baptized, already are Jesus. You already have Jesus inside of you. You already are configured to Jesus, so much so that we can even say to some degree that you are Christ. You are Jesus in the flesh because of your baptism. He's operating in you and through you and around you. And of course, when we sin, we separate ourselves from the Lord bit by bit. But when we go to confession, we are cleansed and purified and strengthened and restored back to that total configuration with Christ. And when we come to Mass and receive Holy Communion, we are nourished and filled and strengthened by His grace. You see, growing in the spiritual life is not always just about trying harder. Because sometimes whenever we try harder, what we're really doing is clinging to our own self-reliance. And we totally forget about God, and we're just trying to be amazing without Him. Growing in the spiritual life is about surrendering, letting go, and trusting in God. It's that image, that story. I think I've told this image before, but it's still helpful to go back to it. The image that St. Therese had whenever she was a little child, young infant, toddler, who could not climb the stairs in her house, but she wanted to go up the stairs. And so what did she do? She started crying, and her sister at the top of the stairs saw her crying and came down and picked her up and brought her upstairs. And it clicked for her as she got older and reflected back on this experience. It clicked. All of these great saints throughout history who had heroic virtue and amazing works of charity, they climbed those stairs and they got to the top of the staircase. But here we are, weak and sinful and impatient and overindulgent and angry and have no self-control, and we're broken and we're wounded and we're bitter and we're depressed and we're anxious, and we don't know how we're going to climb those darn stairs. So we just, in humility, cry out like the baby Therese. And we cry out to God our Father, who's at the top of the staircase. And he comes down the staircase and he lifts us up by his grace. It's not so much about working harder, but following the right technique. And the right technique is God's grace. We can't do this on our own. We will not grow in the spiritual life simply on our own effort. We need God's grace. Yes, we have to cooperate with God's grace, but we need his grace first. We cannot do it by ourselves. So today we, once more, and we will continue to pray this because it's the hardest prayer to pray. Lord, we choose to let go and to trust in you. Give us the grace to follow your will. Amen.